So the sociology of intellectuals was born within a Marxist theory, which developed a materialistic approach of the producers of ideas in order to analyze the role of intellectuals in the revolutionary movement. You can think of Gramsci or Mannheim. Intellectual history was also redefined in a more sociological way with Lucien Febvre's 1947 study on Rabelais and the problem of belief in the 16th century, history of mentalities, and the later development of book history with, of course, Roger Chartier and Darnton's works. In the 1980s, both the political and social history of intellectuals became a whole research domain. While the political history of intellectuals focuses on their political position takings, the social history of intellectuals questions their position in the social structure and the relationship between their engagements and their activities as intellectuals. The work by Christophe Charles is the most representative of this trend. Christophe Charles' approach was very much nourished by sociology and especially by Bourdieu's theory. In France, the sociology of intellectuals was also renewed by this theory. I'm thinking of Anna Boschetti's book on Sartre, my own work on the political position takings of writers during Second World War, which Sébastien mentioned. And we founded a research committee of the French Sociological Association on the sociology of intellectuals and of expertise, which has no equivalent in other places as far as I know, despite the renewal of interest for the sociology of intellectuals in the United States around Randall Collins and the new sociology of ideas, Charles Camick and Neil Gross. I would like here to propose a brief overview of the main questioning and achievements of the sociology of intellectuals while marking some suggestions on its contribution to the sociology of knowledge and to intellectual history. I will provide some examples from the European project InterCo-SSH, International Cooperation in the Social Sciences and the Humanities, which I have coordinated. And we launched a series at Palgrave Macmillan entitled Socio-Historical Studies of the Social and Human Sciences. And here are the three first titles, but there are already two more which came out. And we welcome any proposal in this series. So for this seminar, I will regroup the questions around three perspectives. Intellectual as a social group or social category, the conditions of production and circulation of ideas, and the sociology of interventions. So first, intellectuals as a social group. The first question about intellectuals regards their place in the social structure, which challenges the economic-based class approach or the income-based social stratification approach. The sociology of and history of intellectuals oscillates both between two definitions of intellectuals, a large one and a restricted one. The large approach considers all intellectuals or cultural producers as a group, some even as a class. It can be illustrated by Seymour Lipset's definition of intellectuals as creating those who create, distribute, quote, and apply culture that is the symbolic word of man, including art, science, and religion, unquote. Richard Florida's concept of the creative class can be seen as a contemporary expression of this conception. This large approach was developed in two directions: the sociology and social history of elites. For instance, Jacques Le Goff's study on the intellectuals in the Middle Ages, or the German research on Bildungsbürgertum by Conze und Koka. And the other direction is the sociology and social history of professions, especially I'm thinking of Andrew Abbott's book on the division of expert labor. The restricted definitions of intellectuals is related to the origins of the term itself, which appeared as a noun, a substantive in France in the late 19th century in the context of the Dreyfus affair. It refers to the political engagement of intellectuals in the public sphere, in the name of his or her symbolic capital. You see here on the PowerPoint Zola's individual position taking in his J'accuse in the newspapers L'Aurore, an accusation of the government and of the judiciary powers for flouting truth and justice. But the specificity of the affair is that the Dreyfusards used the form of the petition, gathering their names and titles in order to appear as a group with a political force. This event occurred at a moment of the professionalization of the political careers, a process described by Max Weber, which excluded intellectuals from the political sphere. So the differentiation of this field contributed to the mobilization of intellectuals as a group. Bourdieu's field theory, which draws full consequences from the idea of historical differentiation of social spheres that can be found in Weber's study on the legal sphere, as well as in other works by Weber, but also Durkheim's division of labor, can help us bridge the two definitions of the broader and the more restricted definition of the intellectuals. One can indeed speak about the historical autonomization of an intellectual function. This function was usually carried out by priests, division of labor between temporal and spiritual powers. It is in this sense that Le Goff can speak of intellectuals in the Middle Ages, despite the apparent anachronism. But it was not before the 18th century that the intellectual power became autonomous in the West under the effect of different factors. And I refer here, of course, to Chartier's work, but also to Daniel Roche. So these factors are the urbanizing process, which entailed the centralization of cultural life in the big cities, the secularization process, which made possible the exercise of reason as an end in itself. This is what Kant theorized. The industrializing process, which created the demand for public and private expertise, and which strengthened the social authority of the rising scientific paradigm. Doctors and psychiatrists were granted the role of experts in court, for instance. The progress of literacy, the growth of the print market, which favors the diffusions of the dissemination of ideas among a larger audience than the group of peers. In the 19th century, intellectuals were expanded with the rise of universities. The control on reproduction was from then on mediated by education, and thus depends also on an elite endowed with cultural capital. As a consequence, cultural capital became differentiated from economic capital to an extent that varies across countries. These variations still need to be studied more thoroughly. In Germany, it is the Bildungsbürgertum which embodies this differentiation, of course. In France, it was the capacité. This differentiation has political consequences. In France, the capacité, lawyers, physicians, writers, claimed their political rights in the name of their knowledge against those who were holding nobility titles or economic capital, who were the only groups able to pay for the census, which gave the right to vote. The 1830 revolution is an outcome of this struggle. However, the expansion of education also entails a devaluation of the educational titles and a crisis of social reproduction. The overproduction of graduates gave birth to the category of the intellectual proletariat. Theoretical approaches have been mainly divided around the question whether intellectuals can be designated as a class or not. The conceptions of intellectuals as a class were either in support of their claims or critical of their alleged ambitions to come to power. The theories in support of these claims ground the intellectuals' aspirations at playing a leading social role in the importance of knowledge, intelligence, creativity, talent for progress and or development. They distinguish themselves from manual labor and claim autonomy based on their skills and the responsibility they exert in their work. You all know Saint-Simon's famous parabola. If we suppress all the aristocrats, politicians, clergymen, nothing will happen to society. But if we suppress the scientists, artists, industrials, France would lose its productivity and prestige among nations. This parabola underlies the claims of the capacities or talent for political rights during the Bourbon Restoration, which installed the parliamentary regime in France at the beginning of the 19th century, as they could not afford the census, which was, as I said, too high. The 1830 liberal revolution, again, which brought the Holland monarchy to power and gave the capacity, the right to vote, was an outcome of this struggle. By the turn of the 20th century, this Saint-Simonian conception nourished doctrines such as Taylorism, which expressed social ambitions of engineers to play a leading social role through management. It was also at the core of the project of the Confédération des Travailleurs Intellectuels, launched in 1920, in order to gather all the intellectual professions. So it went from engineers to artists and writers, including the law and medical, the legal and medical professions, as well as academics. So they were gathered in a common trade union, which would play a mediating role between the working class and the employers. It was just after the workers' trade union CGT was recognized by the French government as the spokesman of the working class. The Confédération des Travailleurs Intellectuels became international in 1924 and was represented by the International Labor at the International Labor Organizations, and it still exists. The sociology of professions has also reflected, at least at the beginning, these claims for autonomy. They built the notion of profession on skills, autonomy, and responsibility, and disinterestedness also, and more recently in Andrew Abbott's terms on abstraction. Critical theories of the new class were developed, as shown by Lawrence Peter King and Ivan Zeleny, on one hand by anarchists and Trotskyists, in order to denounce the ambitions of intellectuals to establish their own power in the socialist movement by promoting state socialism, and on the other hand, by theorists like Thorsten Veblen to criticize the rise of technocracy in Western capitalist countries, or Bourdieu when he denounces symbolic domination of or intellectual racism, racisme de l'intelligence. These different approaches share a common view of intellectuals' common interests, be it legitimate or not in their eyes, in establishing themselves as an elite by converting their cultural capital into political power and or economic capital, the claim for higher remuneration or reward. The class approach to intellectuals can be criticized from the standpoint of social conditions, interests, and self-representations or consciousness. The sociology of profession was based on the model of the independent status of the professions. But in fact, the social conditions for intellectual and artistic professions are heterogeneous. They can be practiced either on an independent status, like medicine or law, what we call in French, profession libérale, which is the equivalent of professions in English. But they can also be on an employee status, like engineers, or on a civil servant status, like professors in France or in Italy. This led the independent professions in France in the 1930s to prefer the middle class organizations rather than the Confédération des Travailleurs Intellectuels, doctors especially. Here, a comparative approach would be useful to the sociology of knowledge. The status of university professors varies in different countries. So, as I said, in France and in Italy, they are civil servants, but because academic freedom is recognized, they benefit from a derogatory status. They are evaluated by their peers and not by the hierarchy, and they have to some extent which can change, freedom of expression. These different statuses determine different organizational forms, associations, trade unions, ordre, and degree of professionalization. Moreover, these statuses imply different incomes and lifestyles, from the bourgeois to the bohème, which were translated into different social aspirations. With the development of education, these intellectual professions, which represented the small elite in the 19th century, grew and became more heterogeneous. This is why, from Marx to Bourdieu, other theories have laid stress on the uncertain position of intellectuals in the social structure and on the inner divisions of the intellectual professions. Bourdieu showed that the interest and lifestyle of the professions endowed with cultural capital diverge in many ways from those of the economic elites. In Bourdieu's analytical model, intellectual professions are located at the dominated pole of the dominant class, which explains the affinity of some of them with the dominated working class through homology of positions. So we have here a structural explanation for their propensity to commit themselves in the political sphere. At the same time, Bourdieu's concept of field allows to take into account the specific interests of each intellectual activity, its particular values and rules, as well as its inner heterogeneity in terms of social recruitment and professional conditions. The notion of homology can explain alliances between the dominant or the dominated in different fields. Regarding the relations between different professions, Andrew Abbott has convincingly argued that the division of expert labor is the result of struggles and competition between them to gain state recognition of the jurisdiction on the domain of expertise. This approach is also very useful to think about the divisions between disciplines and the process of academic institutionalization. For instance, sociology had to differentiate itself from psychology and from social philosophy. Economics became an autonomous discipline from law, but the division between disciplines around methods is challenged since the 1960s by a division around objects like gender studies, environmental studies, theater or film studies. The sociology of professions combined with field theory also contributes to the reflection on the institutionalization process. I think we should differentiate three processes: academic institutionalization, the development of a discipline at the university, which implies a new division of disciplines who compete over domains of knowledge. The professional development, it's a term that Andrew Abbott prefers over professionalization because it's less teleological. So it is the indicator for this professional development is usually the creation of professional associations and the development of the profession outside the university. The division of expert labor, for instance, in some countries, there are sociologists outside academia, whereas in France, the profession and title are controlled by the academics. And the third process is the development of a field, of a field of knowledge or a scientific field. And the indicator for that is more the journals, the debates, controversies, and different trends, specialization. So for instance, the research by Jean-Louis Fabiani on French philosophers at the end of the 19th century demonstrate how the group of philosophers who formed a core body with a homogeneous recruitment and with a competitive examination, the agrégation to enter the profession, became a field with the specialization process and the development of an academic publishing field. This is also true of disciplines such as law, history, literary studies, which were body of knowledge that were taught independently of research before the model of the Humboldt University associating teaching and research was introduced in France by the end of the 19th century under the Third Republic. It was the Nouvelle Sorbonne with Gustave Lançon and Seigneur Beauce introducing philological methods in the history of literature and a more positivistic approach to history. Durkheim was also part of them, but while a sociological field was structuring around journals in France and elsewhere at that time, the first chair of sociology at the Sorbonne was not created until 1913, while in the United States, the academic institutionalization was already there by the end of the 19th century. In France, it had to wait until the creation of a licence in 1958. Licence is an undergraduate curriculum. So, and in most countries, the discipline established itself as an academic discipline only in the 1950s. We have an example of at least one case of a professional development of a profession outside the academia without a specific academic curriculum, which is psychoanalysis. So you can have professional development without academic institutionalization. It's not that they didn't try, but they didn't succeed in most places. There are very few departments of psychoanalysis. Other thinkers like Wallerstein, Zygmunt Bauman, and Stefan Colline in his book on universities lay stress on the central division between humanism and science in defining the role of intellectuals in society. We know the importance this divide has had in the history of knowledge, underlying the controversies around the human and social sciences on the hermeneutics versus scientific approach. The philanthropic foundations played a strategic role in imposing empirical methods upon the social science through their funding policies, starting in the 1930s, but especially after 1945. And these policies were partly aimed at combating Marxism. So this leads us to the second perspective, the social conditions of production and circulation of ideas. While the traditional history of ideas has neglected the material aspects of intellectual life, the ideology of singularity, which characterizes the intellectual world, tends to conceal the collective dimension of intellectual activity. The sociology and social history of the intellectuals have enriched our understanding of the social conditions of production and circulation of ideas. Regarding the conditions of production, you have, of course, education, and I refer as an example at Fritz Ringer's enlightening comparison of the German and French educational systems in the 19th century, which is called fields of knowledge. Second aspect is the modes of transmission of cultural capital. So we can think, for instance, of Victor Caradi's study on the recruitment of the French elite school École Normale Supérieure by the end of the 19th century. Third aspect, the analysis of collective trajectories, prosopography. For instance, Christophe Charles compared the social recruitment of different intellectual professions in France at the turn of the 20th century, university professors, writers, higher civil servants. Social recruitment of professors and students partly determines the hierarchy of disciplines. Some disciplines like law and medicine are linked to elites and have a very high rate of reproduction, sons of lawyers and doctors. Disciplines like history and literary studies, the access to which is controlled by the aggregation examination competition, rely on the reproduction of cultural capital. There are many daughters and sons of professors in these disciplines. Sociology in France is one of the lowest disciplines because of the social recruitment of underprivileged students, and probably also the social properties of the faculty. Feminization is also a major issue. The divide between science and the human social sciences in this respect is well known, but it is not inherent to them. One tends to forget that the humanities were historically a man's thing, the cultural capital of the masculine elite. You can see here a graph showing the evolution, the uneven evolution of the uneven feminization of the social and human sciences in French academia. And you can see that there is the feminization, which is one of the major morphologic transformations in the knowledge production, is uneven across discipline and within the inner hierarchy of a discipline. And now the evolution of the production of an author is also an angle of study which cannot be analyzed only with regard to her own biography, but also in relation to other agents in the field, models, competitors, allies. For instance, in her book on Sartre, Anna Boschetti shows that Sartre managed to cumulate both positions occupied by Gide, André Gide, the writer, and Bergson, the philosopher, and thus to overcome the historical rivalry and antagonism between the literary and philosophical fields in France. Bourdieu's concept of the space of possibilities is here useful in order to reconstruct the options that an intellectual is confronted with. Bourdieu defines the choices made by an agent as position taking in the field. These position takings are determined by the agent's dispositions, habitus, and they have effects on the field since they contribute to modify the space of possibilities. So this is very different, for instance, from Neil Groth's notion of self-concept, through which he tries to explain Richard Rorty's trajectory, which is a more intentionalist, self-conscious, and undetermined approach than Bourdieu's notion of habitus, and also more individual than collective. And if I take Bourdieu as a case study, I can show that his own concept of habitus results from his attempt to overcome the oppositions between structuralism and Marxism, but also between objectivism, Marxism and structuralism, and subjectivism, Sartre's existentialism, which structured the intellectual field in the 1960s. Scientific controversies are key moments, but also intellectual controversies, key moments when the theoretical and methodological options are formulated explicitly and have thus drawn the attention of the sociologists of science. But the sociology of science has not been much interested in the human and social sciences. Moreover, the sociology of science tends to focus only on academic controversies, while field theory invites us to enlarge the scope to the intellectual field. For instance, Roland Lardinois' work on the specialist of India in France in the 19th and 20th century shows that the academic production on this topic cannot be understood if we don't place it in the broader context of the space of production of discourses and representation on the Orient, on the East, which frame the debates and issues at stake despite the growing autonomy of the academic field. The study of intellectual production has also been renewed by transnational approaches. We published recently a special issue of Actes de la recherche en sciences sociales on transnational intellectual fields. These fields form as a result of colonialism, as Tristan Leperlier showed about Algerian intellectuals, exile from authoritarian countries, the publishing industry, which form linguistic areas which have no state borders, or trans or supranational bodies like the Catholic Church or Francophonie, as showed by Madeleine Bédécarré for Francophonie. Forced or voluntary immigration or even visits abroad may have an impact in the evolution of an intellectual trajectory, and this is a topic of high interest these days for obvious reasons. As an example, I'll mention Laurent Jean-Pierre's comparative research on Lévi-Strauss and Gurvitch in order to understand the different impact of exile on two intellectuals. So we know how much Lévi-Strauss' innovative anthropological theory owes to his stay in the United States and as an exile, and his meeting with Roman Jakobson, the linguist, which was also an exile, from which he borrowed the structural approach as well as his discovery of Anglo-American cultural anthropology. So it is due to his encounter with this new space of possibilities that he managed to renew the anthropological field in France. The same did not happen with Gourevitch, who was elder and who focused on his own work and did not learn from the new opportunities during his exile. But the social conditions of immigration are uneven. And I recently tried to identify a series of parameters for a comparative approach of these conditions, including age, gender, class, race, but also the relations between the culture of origin and the host culture, and disciplinary specificities, for instance, natural sciences versus the humanities, which are more anchored in national traditions. So it's more difficult to move from one place to another and to develop a dialogue abroad in a new country. Also forms of expression, language in particular, and pre-existing transnational networks and the structuring of fields of cultural production in the country of origin and the host country. Regarding language, the status of the original language in the host country vary. For instance, just think of the status of French or German in the United States in the 1930s, 1940s, which was very highbrow, whereas the status of Arabic today in European countries is low, despite a very rich intellectual tradition in this language and also former intellectual exchanges in medieval Europe, in Andalusia especially. Regarding the selection process by hosting structures, we know, for instance, that the Rockefeller Foundation was highly selective in supporting scholars at risk. It considered, so in the 1930s and 40s, it considered reputation as well as age and gender. So young men were preferred explicitly, and the applicants' command of English and their pre-established local relations. So former Rockefeller scholarship winners were favored. So we can observe the same logics applying to the different hosting organizations today for migrants. And I'm on the board of the PAUSE program, which does a huge work to host exile scholars, endangered scholars. We prefer this term, but still there are mechanisms of selection that are taken into, that are applied. And last aspect of the conditions of production, which also implies circulation, is the material conditions of publishing. I already mentioned the development of the history of publishing. The sociology of publishing also developed, and Bourdieu did some work about France. I can mention John Thompson's work on the transformation of Anglo-American publishing, merchants of culture. Journals have been key objects for both intellectual history and the sociology of intellectuals. And you can see here the Frédéric Matonti's work on the communist journal La Nouvelle Critique, her book Intellectuelle communiste. So the journal was an angle to approach this topic of the communists in France in the 1960s, 70s. There are also some studies on the academic publishing field, and one of them is John Thompson on Anglo-American academic presses. I have studied the social conditions of the transnational circulation of scholarly books in translation. And these are the factors that determine the chances for a work to be translated. And as you can see from these parameters, these factors, the chances are, the opportunities are uneven across scholars regarding the centrality of the original language. So if you write in English, you have more chance, or French or German, more higher chance to be translated than if you write in a peripheral language. I use Abraham de Swan's system of language approach, central and periphery. It's not a judgment about the language, it's just a position in the system. Second factor is the collective symbolic capital of a national tradition in a discipline. For instance, German philosophy has a high symbolic capital compared to American philosophy, for instance. So there might be more translations from English in the social sciences, but there would be, I studied that, more philosophical books translated from German, at least until the mid-1990s, when there was a change. Individual symbolic capital of the author also, of course, plays a role, and you have those what we call brand names, Foucault, Derrida, Bourdieu, like the names of classics, where you don't examine even the book, you just translate because of this symbolic capital. But there are other properties of the author, like education, academic position, social capital, and also gender. I just want to show you that the chance for a female author to be translated is much lower than for men. You have the share of social science and humanities female authors translated from English into French and from French into English is during the years 2003 to 2013, you see around 15%. 16%, knowing that this market is the most open to female authors. Just to compare to literature, literature is for contemporary authors, translations from French into English, it's 1/3, it's twice as much. And here is an example for the brand names. You can see who are the most translated French authors in English, and you will recognize most of them. I don't need to even explain. You have Badiou, Hélène Tixou, Derrida, Jean-Luc Nancy, Jacques Rancière, Bernard Stiegler, Bourdieu, Paul Virilio, and so on. But another important factor that is often neglected is the social capital of the publisher. And you can see that the elder and most established publishing university presses are those who export the most. So you have the example for French for the same period, and you can see that Oxford University Press, Cambridge, Harvard University Press, Princeton University Press arrive first on this list. Of course, if you compare the other way around from France, it won't be academic presses, it will be the trade publishers who still publish social sciences and humanities, and the first which arrived for social sciences and humanities is Le Seuil, while for literature it's Gallimard. So you see the specificity according to the domain. And then you have properties of the book, the content, theory versus empirical studies, trendy topics, like, for instance, in the 1990s, gastronomy was a very trendy topic on the American market. Of course, there are political hot topics. Topics around Islam became very important after 9/11. But also material factors like the length of the book will count as a factor. And then you have national and international reception of the book. So if you sold already the rights for translation to other languages, you have more chance to be translated, though everybody knows that reception is very local, but still publishers say in interviews or editors that they are impressed when they see that the book has already been translated in another language. And then, of course, you have funding, and the access to funding is also unequal. National aids, research grants, and so on. So translation has to do with cultural transfers and the importation process. Cultural transfers can have been evoked by the supporters of entangled history against comparison, which is based, according to them, on methodological nationalism. In the Interco project, we propose to combine both approaches, thus understand how the circulation of models and of ideas contributed to the institutionalization of the social sciences and the humanities and to their development. But we also resituated these approaches as embedded in the realm of the power relations between countries, since the circulation of models and of works do not happen randomly. It goes from the dominant countries to the dominated ones. And the dominant countries have long before what we call globalization understood their interest in training foreign future elites as a way to control the reproduction process in the countries they belonged. These elites would then, when they go back, import models from the dominant countries, thus contributing to universalize them, allow contacts, and also favor the exportation of cultural items and products like books to these countries. This is the critique I have to DiMaggio and Powell's seminal paper on the mechanism of organizational isomorphism. So they point three mechanisms: constraint, imitation out of competition, and the circulation of professional norms. So I transpose this model to publishing and to the academia, and it's very fruitful. So for instance, constraint applies very well to the communist regimes, imitation to the circulation of the Humboldt model of the university associating research and teaching before the Second World War, and the professional norms apply very well to the academic institutionalization and professional development of some disciplines after the Second World War as a result of the creation of international associations of sociology, political science, economy, psychology, so on. So these mechanisms are relevant to the circulation of organizational models in the intellectual sphere, but you still need to combine them with symbolic capital to understand why the model circulates in one way or the other way round. And I discussed that with Paul DiMaggio, and he agreed that you should introduce symbolic capital and also differentiation strategies, as I proposed. So one should also take into account the role of specific bodies in the international circulation of models. Academic cooperation and exchanges between countries was fostered by the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation of the League of Nations in the interwar period, and by the UNESCO after the war, as well as by philanthropic foundations that I already mentioned. UNESCO impulsed the creation of this international association in sociology, political science, economy, and so on. And there is more and more work on the role of UNESCO, and I'm also working on the archive. But what is interesting is to think here of a process that goes from the international to the national and not the other way around, because this association really fostered the establishment of disciplines such as sociology. I've been just working on sociology in many countries. Circulation and transfers raise the question of reception, including obstacles such as economic, political, cultural, but also appropriation and usages by cultural mediators and importers. In my book on the responsibility of the writer that Sebastian mentioned, concerning France since the 19th century, I focused on literary trials as arenas of struggles for the freedom of expression and of creation. Such arenas are still relevant in illiberal countries like Turkey nowadays, for instance. I developed the thesis that the autonomy of the literary field was gained not only against the market, as Bourdieu analyzed in The Rules of Art, but also against the state and the dominant ideology and morality. Using Foucault's notion of the author function, as well as Durkheimian sociologist Paul Fauconnet's distinction between objective and subjective responsibility, I showed that writers developed their own conception of responsibility against the legal responsibility that was imposed upon them. There is a direct direct link between these trials and the figure of the engaged intellectual as embodied by Zola in the Dreyfus affair and as theorized by Sartre after the war. Censorship also operated in the international circulation of texts. For instance, some of Zola's novels were censored in England and both his publisher and translator prosecuted. Regarding the role of cultural mediators, they apply, of course, for the circulation of the works in the intellectual field where the work was produced, but also it applies to their circulation in time and in space. And I focus here on the transnational circulation. The very notion of French theory is revelatory of the mechanism of importation and of the role of importers, scholars, translators, publishers, because, as you know, French theory does not exist in France. There is no French theory in France. It was a construction made by the importers of these different authors in the United States. And this reminds us that, as Bourdieu remarks, quoting a sentence by Marx, it reminds us that texts circulate without their context. And we could add also circulation in space as in time. So Bourdieu identifies three key operations: selection, marking, and interpretation. The reception processes has been at the core of many recent works in France, and the study of a work implies the building of indicators of peer recognition, like reviews, citation, prizes, how the work becomes a classical work, part of the canon, inclusion in handbooks or and textbooks. And we can have quantitative methods. We can use quantitative methods to have a broader view of these three mechanisms of selection, marking, and interpretation. So, for instance, before I switch to this one, you can see Johanna Poppa's work on the importation of Eastern European writers in France, their works, not the authors, in France during the communist period, which is a quantitative and qualitative study. And you have such work on citations, which have to do with interpretation. So, for instance, Amin Brahimi's work on citations of new Muslim intellectuals in journals. Reception indeed includes forms of appropriation and the social uses of works interpreting. For instance, there is a research on the reception of Tocqueville showing the anti-Marxist uses of his work. Forms of appropriations can be studied in prefaces, commentaries, reviews, citations, and uses as research program. I'll just mention the work by Mathieu Rochecorne on the reception of John Rawls and the theories of justice in France. So it came out 2 years ago in my series at CNRS Edition, and it's now being translated and will appear in the series Ideas in Context with Cambridge University Press. So Mathieu Rochecorne shows that Rawls was appropriated in France for political purposes in order to oppose his notion of fairness, translated as équité, to the French conception of equality. While in Rawls, it originally meant positive discrimination in favor of the poor people, it was used by French reformers in order to contest social rights. It was not before the 1990s that Rawls became part of the French philosophical canon. Rochecorne shows how it was cleaned from all traces of its former political appropriations and published in academic editions, then selected for the agrégation program in philosophy. So still this examination, which is the major consecration for a philosopher. And now to the sociology, the forms of intervention. So traditionally, the political history of intellectuals which developed in France focused on the analysis of their political commitments, either on right-wing or on left-wing or on specific groups. So using a field approach, Christophe Charles' analysis of the Dreyfus affair reveal the homology between the writer's position in the literary field and their political position taking. The dominants, especially those at the Académie Française, were anti-Dreyfusards, the avant-garde were Dreyfusards, and the intermediary space of the naturalists was split. My findings about the political position taking of writers under the German occupation also revealed a similar homology. The pro-Vichy regime were elder established authors, whereas the resistance gathered mostly young poets, but all the literary institutions, Académie Française, Académie Goncourt, were themselves divided. Tristan Leperlier could also confirm such a homology between political choices and literary position in the case of Algerian writers during the civil war of the 1990s. Besides the issue of the political choice, one can question the form of the political interventions. In their overview of new trend in the sociology of intellectuals, Guy Leyal and Larissa Burgos remark an evolution towards the sociology of interventions. I have suggested to consider the form of their intervention, which vary from the collective form, petition, trade unions, or organizations to advocate a cause, such as anti-fascism, to individual position taking. It varies also from the role of the prince advisor to social and political protest, through manifestos, mobilization, through expertise and propaganda also. This diversity of forms of political interventions needs to be related to the structure of the intellectual fields. I have proposed a typology of the forms of intervention of intellectuals according to three main factors. First, their position in the field, dominant or dominated, while the intellectuals endowed with high amount of symbolic capital can make individual interventions. Those who are not endowed with such capital, especially the newcomers, tend to gather in groups for their interventions. And then you have names of groups like surrealists or situationists. However, at both the dominant and dominated pole, the modes of intervention must be differentiated according to the degree of autonomy with regard to external demand. Some intellectuals play the role of gatekeepers of the social order, responding to the demand of the government or of the dominant class, while other ones cultivate their critical function individually, thanks to the symbolic capital enclosed in their proper names, or collectively in petitions, which displays the sum of symbolic capital in each name and or represented position, like in the Dreyfus affair. At the dominated pole, one should also distinguish the autonomous engagement of the avant-garde, which prefer the form of the manifesto signed by collective name. I mentioned already surrealism, situationism, we can think also of futurism, and the heteronymous commitment of dominated intellectuals, like intellectuals of a political party, think of the communist intellectuals, or Catholic intellectuals belonging to an institution. A third factor is specialization linked to the division of expert labor, which introduces new forms of intervention since it relies on certified skills of expertise as opposed to the charisma of the prophet. The rise of expertise as mode of intervention in the political sphere is exemplified by the think tanks studied by Tom Medved, as opposed to expertise, which is relatively heteronymous since it relies on external demand. The figure of the specific intellectual was theorized by Foucault. It is also opposed to the figure of the total intellectual embodied by Sartre, since it relies on expert knowledge rather than on general speculations. For instance, Foucault's position taking on prison. At the dominated pole, the autonomous pole is represented by advocacy and protest group specializing on an issue. They correspond to what Bourdieu has defined as the collective intellectual. For instance, the group he founded to combat neoliberalism, Raison d'agir, or the GISTI, a group of legal scholars and professionals specializing on immigration. These groups produce counter expertise, and as opposed to that, the heteronymous form can be illustrated by the specialization which occurred within political parties, in particular the Communist Party, but also the Socialist Party after 1945. So intellectuals were assigned to specialized tasks in this period. In my book on writers and politics in France, published in 2018, which includes some articles previously published in English, I also suggest to link the form of intervention of writers to their position within the literary field. Combining the dominant-dominated and autonomy-heteronomy factors, I distinguish ideal-typical modes of intervention, notabilities, aesthetes, avant-garde, and lampoonists. In the epilogue of the book, I argued that these ideal types are still relevant today, in France at least. For instance, Finkielkraut is an example of the notabilities, Éric Zemmour of the lampoonists, Annie Ernaux and Le Clésio of the aesthetes, and we still have avant-garde authors who intervene, such as Chloé Delhomme. Or Virginie Despentes, another example. So, conclusion. While the sociology and history of intellectuals in France has departed from the traditional history of ideas, focusing on the social and material conditions of production and circulation, as illustrated by the synthesis edited by Christophe Charles and Laurent Jean-Pierre, La vie intellectuelle en France, a new current of social history of political ideas has developed in political science in the past decade, informed by the Cambridge School of Intellectual History, mainly Skinner, around Frédéric Matonti, namely, and Rochecorne is representative of it. He was her student, who suggests to combine the Cambridge School method of radical historicization of texts with the sociology of the intellectual mediators and the material conditions of production and circulation of texts. Others refer to Begriffsgeschichte, Cassirer, Koselleck. My current research on the idea of disinterestedness tries to adopt a longue durée and transnational perspective on the uses and circulation of the concept across France, England, and Germany since the 18th century to nowadays, and to bridge a social history of ideas and of concepts with the sociology of intellectual and artistic professions. In a similar vein, but also in an attempt to bridge this French trend, with the American mode of doing intellectual history, I'm co-editing with Stefanos Geroulanos from NYU a handbook professionally entitled Handbook of History and Sociology of Ideas, which is in the making and will appear next year, hopefully, and to which Sebastian has kindly contributed on the concept of public sphere. And you can see here the table of content. It's organized in 3 parts. Theoretical and methodological questions. For instance, Sebastian addresses the relevance of the concept of public sphere to non-Western countries, such as China. Domains, we crossed history and sociology of ideas with history and sociology of philosophy, of law, of life sciences, of natural sciences, of the social sciences, of literature, of politics, of emotions, and also with book history. And the third part is about circulations, the question of comparativism and transfer, should they be opposed or combined, and how to study the migration of ideas and the migration of intellectuals themselves, persons, and how to decentralize intellectual history from Western ethnocentrism. This last point is, of course, one of the most important challenges for the sociology of intellectuals today. On one hand, the modern model of the intellectual have circulated around the world. On the other hand, in many places, it is appropriated and more or less combined with traditional figures of the lettré, the literate, which have existed in Arabic, in Chinese, or in Indian cultures under various names, more or less differentiated from priests or religious learned persons. Even in the religious field, you can usually find a more intellectual pole and a more learned intellectual pole and a more secular popular pole. for the history and sociology of ideas, but also for our own epistemology, this raises the important issue of epistemological decentering, which can be studied through the debates on authenticity and modernity in the Arab, Indian, or Chinese cultures. For instance, Amr Hamzawi wrote a paper on these debates in the Arab countries, but which can also serve to question our own ethnocentric academic episteme. Should this decentering lead us or not to culture, not only to culture relativism, but also to epistemological relativism? I'm currently working on these questions. I cannot develop today, but my answer is no. So we can we can decenter. I'm trying to demonstrate that we can decenter all the while without falling into scientific relativism, epistemologic relativism. The other challenge would be to think of how the figure of intellectual is contested or redefined today, among other through social media, but also through feminization. Sebastian Weg, in his book on the new Chinese intellectuals, which he calls Minyan, so sorry for the pronunciation, non-official intellectuals who reject the universalist posture and are interested in subalterns and in gender issues. So this is an example of such a study, and he interestingly chose to focus on blogs and on social media rather than on individuals, like the traditional history of intellectuals would have done. However, we also find a more classical figure of the intellectual under feminine dresses, with Turkish or Indian writers such as Elif Shafak and Arundhati Roy. Sorry, I won't read the quote, but you can read it. And social media is not the only place for expression of ideas and political position takings. A new arena for the expression of their political commitment is literary festivals, which have multiplied since the 1990s. Just have an idea, it's just a few examples of the multiplication of these festivals, and there are now more than 450 festivals only for the English language. These festivals attract a large audience, as you can see here. For instance, so one of the biggest is Jaipur, 350,000 persons which came to the festival. Many of them are more commercial or more literary, but I suggest to consider some of the international festivals like Étonnant Voyageur in Saint-Malo, or the Berlin Literature Festival, or the World Voices Festival of International Literature, which is was founded by the American Pen Club, as offering an alternative transnational public sphere where writers and some thinkers from all countries can circulate their works and ideas, and they can disseminate them. They have on these festivals have on their agenda political topics such as the post-colonial fracture, immigration, national identities, freedom of expression, and so on. So these two new spaces, social media and festivals, invite for new forms of interventions, as studied by Sebastian for the Minyan intellectuals, thus linking the mode of circulation with that of the form of intervention, in the same way journals and books did before and still do. I'm happy they still count today in intellectual life. So I stop here. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gisèle, for this wonderful, wide-ranging talk. So the way we're going to run things is going to be as follows. So if any of you have any questions, as already mentioned by the moderators in the chat, so please feel to post them to the chat box, or you may also raise your hand. If you post your questions to the chat box, I will read them out to Gisèle. Otherwise, you may raise your hand and ask for the microphone, and the technicians will open your mic. Well, there's a first question here. We can start off with that maybe from Analia Gerbaldo, who says, thanks, Gisèle, for this wonderful presentation. I would ask you if you have in mind a new project in the line of the Interco SSH. Maybe you can share with the rest of the audience what exactly that is. I would underline the importance of your conclusions, including your methodological decisions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Analia. So Analia Gerbaldo is very dear colleagues in Argentina who took part in the project on international cooperation in the social sciences and humanities, and we worked in the frame of a European project which has very much managing constraints, but still we produced a lot of data, but also of synthesis and work and confronted, and so sure, there are many possible projects, and one of them would be about this issue, I think, of the debates about epistemological decentering. But another could be about migrant intellectuals. We tried in France to get some funding for such a project, but still haven't managed to get it. It won't prevent us from doing research. That's the chance we have. That's our force compared to the natural sciences, and we have to. So there are things that are more difficult to do without resources, but still we can do many things without these resources. Yes, so for instance, about immigration, Analia's own work is about how academics in literary studies continued working in Argentina under the dictatorship, and where they were pushed out of the universities. And it's happening now in Turkey and in other countries. And what happens, how do these networks organize? So there is a recent paper by Alihan Meski has been studying how these networks get solidarity and help from foreign institutions to continue doing research, but also manage to find their own way to continue. That's, I think, a very important topic today, that universities are more and more threatened in illiberal, I put illiberal in quote marks because I'm not very fond of this concept, but just to know, we all know what we are talking about. So the recognized status of academics today in many countries is challenged because some regimes want, and let's think of India, of course, and Brazil. And it happens at the same time as merchandization of knowledge. So there are two forces: authoritarianism, which reduce academic freedom, and neoliberalism, which transforms knowledge, the production of knowledge into something that has to respond to a demand. So it's a very and I profit. Sorry for the long answer, but it raises so many ideas, and I profit from this opportunity to mention an initiative we launched at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, and to which Sebastian is also contributed in a panel on China. It's about academic freedom, and there is a blog on Trafo where some of our reflections on the history of the concept, the philosophy, the legal damage. It's a complicated concept, so where we get from many countries contributions, and we want to expand that and invite all of you to contribute to this blog. Thank you.
We have another question here from Flavia de Paiva. Hello, Gisèle. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to know if you think social network analysis can be a methodology that could be integrated into those analyses, and how you think of it in your own sociological thinking, how you would translate social networks into your own sociology, if it's not too much to talk about.
Thank you so much for this great question. I'm very, very interested in this methodology of social networks, and we've been using it a lot. What I saw, I showed by Amin Brahimi, Mohamed Amin Brahimi, the citations is using network analysis. So I hope we are talking of network analysis, right? So this methodology, and I even wrote a paper to think how to bridge field theory with network analysis without accepting because there are contradictions, of course, between the idea that the society would arise from networks, from individuals who interact between themselves, and field theory, which is more Durkheimian, thinking that structures pre-exist individuals. So we have here an antithetic theoretical frame, but still the methodology of network analysis can be used within the frame of network of field theory. And I was even thinking how, for instance, my correspondence analysis, where you don't have network analysis, it's a different methodology of the writers' political choices during the German occupation in France. What would it have been if I used a network analysis? And it's very interesting because you can see that there are networks. The resistance, they form around some journals, so they are related among themselves. Members of the Académie Française are also a network, and they are all around the institution, and so it works. And there is a very interesting comparison done between these two methodologies, multiple correspondence analysis and network analysis, for the same data, same group, by François Denord on the thinkers of neoliberalism, the old sense of neoliberalism. I hope I answered the question. I cannot see the people who speak. Is it possible to show the? It's in the chat. Okay, they don't show up.
It looks like you answered the question.
Okay.
So let me maybe slip in something here, since there's a little pause. Well, this is really a very kind of obvious question, probably, but still, I think it may bear some further reflection. You mentioned the issue of blogs and various types of social discourses and so on. So doesn't this kind of lead to a sort of blurring of the borders of who intellectuals actually are? So how do you actually still define an intellectual in that kind of context? And maybe to make this question a little less banal, I would say, I mean, I think we're all of us very much struck by the transformations of the public sphere that have been brought about by COVID, and the issue of specialized knowledge and the relationship between public discourses and specialized knowledge, I think, has been very deeply transformed, and I think that's something that we will probably have to think about for quite a few years. So in that context, I mean, how would you, where everyone is producing public speech about subjects of relative technicity, like epidemiology or sanitary control measures, or so on and so on. How do you define an intellectual intervention, if we depersonalize this a little bit, but going back to the sociology of interventions, how do you define an intellectual intervention in this context, or what different types of interventions do you see?
Thank you so much, Sebastian. It's a great question, and it follows from the kind of, but it goes further, kind of idea I had in the end to rethink the interventions with the type of media we have. Of course, the borders of a field are never settled, and they are always, and it allows me to say this, an object of struggle, because some people claim to be part of it and some try to push them out of the field. Some recognize them as being part of it and some don't. And that's what we study, because fields do not exist. Of course, it's an abstract concept that just help us to build the object and to build this competition and struggles around the symbolic capital that is specific to the field and that cannot be reduced to other kinds of capital, such as political or economic. But still, you're totally right to raise this question, because the social media have challenged the traditional modes of, not only the traditional modes of intervention of intellectuals, some of them have not yet converted to the new social media, and we have to learn how to do this. I mean, not everybody, I just started with Twitter recently, and I find it quite difficult. I have Facebook for a long time, but and the usages of them are very different according to people. You can use it as just to publicize your work, but you can use it as a political tool, and Twitter is more political, very clearly, than Instagram, for instance. So it's interesting to see how the media defines the type of intervention, but also the form of the intervention, because of course in Twitter, you can send to a paper, but you can develop very much the argument. So it's a way to just address, so I'm not of those persons who say it's finished with thought and the social media has destructed the argumentation. It can be used in very different ways. So Twitter can be a very useful tool to get attention on things that you wouldn't have looked at because you are so much overwhelmed by information and you don't have time to manage. And suddenly you see this person that you're interested in, that you're following, addressing, sending a reference to a paper that you want to go and look at. And it seems to me as an important tool to make some order, but like I don't think that internet is a kind of flat space, which is a different medium from. It's a different medium, of course, but it's not a flat space. It's also a field with hierarchies, spaces, different. You have very good journals. And or blogs that you are interested in with very high intellectual profile and which are followed. What it contests, what it challenges, and this is why many of the more many of the notabilities that I call notabilities are against that, is that they challenge their own authority. Suddenly, you know, people who didn't have access to the traditional media can speak. So, oh, what a shock, you know, people can speak and they can express what they think. So, and then, of course, some people can become intellectuals through these media. Some people can become intellectuals in prison. I mean, I would like to cite the case, an amazing book by colleagues, Yassine Al-Haj Saleh, whom I met at Wissenschaft College in Berlin, about how he became an intellectual in prison. It's not about this, it's about the experience in prison, but he was 18 when he entered. He didn't have the opportunity to get any academic training, and still he is a writer, intellectual, very important figure. So you don't need necessarily to go through all the institutionalized places to become an intellectual. So it's through the recognition process, through also the work, because some can become, it's very famous that the first secretary of the Académie Française, it's a very high position, secrétaire de l'Académie Française, it's the head of the Académie Française in the 17th century, hadn't written a word. He became, he hadn't published any work. He was elected just because, he was nominated just because of his correspondence with people. So the social capital but also the writing, of course, of this was the symbolic capital of these gatherings. So I think it's more, I don't have a precise answer, because I think it's something we should study, and that could be also what Analia asked. It could be another, following your work on blogs, and it could be and also how these blogs create transnational spheres. That would be fascinating, for instance.
Thank you very much. Meanwhile, Alihan has posted the link to the Academic Freedom blog for those of you who
Thank you so much, Alihan.
Look at the chat box.
And you could also send a link to your paper in AOC, though it's in French, but maybe some of the audience, people in the audience can read French. And there are 3 free trials on AOC.
Let me see if I can find it, if Alihan is too modest.
No, he will post it. You are busy with that.
I found it. It's coming. Okay, well, I was saying before the talk we won't have time to chat, but it's nice that actually we do maybe have some time to chat, so we can just continue chatting in that case.
I left some time for the discussion, so.
That's perfect. Another question I wanted to ask you is, I already wanted to ask you that question at the beginning, and then you picked up on this again in the conclusion, the diversity of intellectual traditions, and the fact that pre-modern figures reappear in redefinitions of intellectuals coming from different cultural traditions, and they are somehow redefined, and maybe they also circulate. So I wanted to ask a little bit, I hope this isn't too precise of a question, but there's one tradition you didn't mention that much, which is the Russian tradition, and which is also very important in China, and I think in many places beyond Europe, the intelligentsia tradition, which is seen as kind of less elitist and maybe more collective. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that in particular, and more generally non-Western traditions and their place in your kind of geography of center and periphery.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sebastian. And I would say that intelligentsia is closer to Bildungsbürgertum than to the traditional lettrés. I think it's part of the bourgeoisie, which were more learned and which developed and invested in cultural capital. I'm not a specialist of Russia, of course, but that's my feeling of it. So it's closer to the intellectuals, but they did not the French intellectuals. But the notion of intellectual is more linked, as I said, on one hand to politicization, and on the other to professional organization, whereas intelligentsia is perhaps the state of the Bildungsbürgertum, which is gathering together in sociabilities, circulating thoughts, works, publishing a lot, and also they were very, very international, writing, reading in 2, 3, 4 languages, and especially French. So they were corresponding with many intellectuals. I mean, this notion of West and non, it's like, it's notions that, of course, I think you agree with me that we use them for facility to know what we're talking about, but at the same time, we of course reject and contest them, and we learn from Edward Said how the East was built by the West, but we could also think how the West built itself by opposing to that's what he says, and the Russian intelligentsia, in my sense, is not these intellectual traditions, learned traditions with a long past, more linked to religion, but not only, because in Arabic countries, of course, it's linked to religion, but not only. It was really knowledge. It developed, it was philosophy, and in India as well. So the thing is that they were, so now I enter a little the question I mentioned about the epistemological relativism. My claim, one of my claims is to say that we built Western epistemological Western epistemology as a coherent body of thought in the 20th century, but based on traditions, while evincing the contact, the cultural contact that existed within these different traditions. I mean, Andalusia was very important in the circulation of knowledge. And until the 18th century, there is a great book written about this, I just now cannot remember the name of fortunately of the author, that shows that until the 18th century, histories of philosophies started either in India or in China, and they all recognized that the Greek philosophers went to Egypt to be trained, and it was in the 18th century that a new history of philosophy was invented by the Kantian, who wanted to defend Kant against Hume, and who didn't care at all about philosophy, about the history of philosophy, but it was just. But at the same time, they did evince. They declared that that philosophy started with the Greek. And not elsewhere, and not before, and from this moment on, it is something that is challenging for thought, because it's the moment of autonomization of philosophy, which at the same time evinces the so-called non-Western traditions. And but what my claim is that the influences, the importations were there. They are part of this knowledge. You evince it in the history, but it's part of this knowledge, and we just have to do reconstruct the history of these links, these contacts, which is being done now, but also think of the epistemological consequences of that, and not only study the circulation of ideas in Andalusia up to date. I don't know if it fully answers your question, but it's just a start, and it could be the project we mentioned.
No, definitely. I think I was hoping to hear more about this issue of concretely what you're thinking about in the longue durée and the different cultural traditions, and how to include them.
But I think, for instance, now there is a rediscovery of Ibn Khaldun, whose thought was so important. And there are other examples. And even for the recent history, we think that sociology was invented only in France, but or in the United States. But in Russia, there was a chair of sociology since the beginning of I think the first chair was 1916 or 1917, but Russian immigrants created an école des hautes études of social sciences, which taught sociology in 1901 in France. So you see, and also I'm writing a paper about this example of history of sociology, that it's not a national history. Even the recognition of Durkheim was translated in Brazil in 1937, and it was one of the first translations of Durkheim. It was before Parsons. It was at the same moment, but in English, in the United States, it appeared in 1938. And it was Parsons who made him a reference for sociology. In France, he was not. He was attacked all the time. And in the 50s, it's through Parsons that the reference to, and 60s, that reference to Durkheim came back and became legitimate in France. So this we need to do a kind of transnational history and to break. Of course, there are national traditions as well, and that is what my colleague, my other dear colleague Johan Elbrun has developed. There are national intellectual traditions or culture, intellectual tradition. There are specificities. Of course, if you think of the sociology of professions, it's very linked to American context. And when the German immigrants, migrants from left Germany and arrived in the United States, they heard about the sociology of profession, and they said, what is that? I mean, what is that? Beruf is not profession, it's something else. So how to think about this? And also in Germany, like in France, most of this profession developed within the state, not out of the state. So I think these structural comparisons enrich our thinking of break with the kind of West, non-West divide and help us rethink. For instance, there were very important sociologists in India, so it went through, colonialized through in the interwar period, but they also bridged it with local traditions. So that's, I think, a fascinating challenge for us to think about this.
Definitely. We have a follow-up question from Flavia, who writes, Gisèle, I'm working with art, and one of your texts in which you talk about intellectuality, political engagement, and you establish a relationship with the signing of collective documents. I can't recall if they're called manifestos. In the case of art, the signing of art manifestos marked modern art, and those manifestos from futurism to, for example, concretism, display different levels of straight politicization, like in futurism, and obscured formalization in other manifestos. Nevertheless, it seems to me that there are differences in what political manifestos and art manifestos achieve, both in the effects of consecration and in group formation. But I would like to know if you have any thoughts on those artistic phenomena.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I totally agree that there is a difference in the form, though of course there are many. The avant-garde imported, even the word avant-garde was imported from the political sphere. So the avant-garde are politicized because of their dominated position, and it doesn't mean that the dominant are not political, but they euphemize politics through morals or aestheticization. So the avant-garde, they kind of politicize their interventions through these political forms that are also very, maybe very sometimes aggressive and like the Surrealist manifestos, but they have specificities because and this is where the field concept is useful. Their signification can be understood only if you refer to power relation within the field. Otherwise, you cannot understand the Surrealist manifesto about Anatole France, un cadavre. Anatole France was a very recognized French writer of the end of the 19th century, and the Surrealists attacked him in this and saying he's a dead person and he has no legacy, and we want to break with that. So this is the way, and this is the specificity of art field, and this is close to politics. In my last book on writers and politics, I made a kind of systematic comparison of functioning of the literary field and the political field, and the art fields, like the literary field, they function in a very similar mode to the political, in the sense that it's very bipolarized, and the opposition, the struggles are open. The struggles for competitions are open. It's very different from academia, where the struggles, now they are more and more open, but they are usually more feutré, more silenced. or euphemized. If you want to get a job, you won't oppose, of course, the people who are in the position to give you the job, and then depends. It can be a strategy, but then it's a strategy imported from the intellectual field, and it can be a winning strategy, but it's always a risky strategy. So for the avant-garde, this way of doing it's a mechanism of the field, as Bourdieu says, that is evolution through revolution. You have to change the space of possibilities, and since Romanticism, originality has become the main value for assessing the authenticity and the quality of art, and this originality must be asserted, defended. Sometimes you assert it while it's not in the in the work. I distinguish between author strategies or artist strategies and their creative or writing strategies. So what you can observe they actually do in their works, and what they claim to do, or how they position themselves in the space. And I think it's interesting to have this double approach, and not suppose that they do what they say they do, because it can be a strategy which is not necessarily accomplished in the work. And again, the signification of this strategy within relatively autonomous, it's always relative, but relatively autonomous fields can be understood. Their signification depend on the specific issues at stake within the field, and this is why you need to reconstruct all the issues at stake at that moment, because otherwise it creates misunderstandings, kind of anachronic reading of this. I hope I answered. The question is very rich, and I mean, it's a whole research program. There is a website created by, I have to find it, some of my younger colleagues, about literary manifestos since the 19th century in French, and it's a great endeavor. But now I don't have it under. I don't remember the name of the website.
Well, keep a close watch on Gisèle's Twitter account to see whether. Any other questions?
My Twitter is not very active. But I just posted Sari Hanafi's, so the head of the International Sociological Association, the president, the current president, his blog that we translated on academic freedom in the Arab countries, and I recommend this reading very much, like the others, indeed.
Okay, another question. In 2022, Brazil celebrates 100 years of the Modern Art Week. The artists involved and the Manifesto Pau Brasil sought to welcome influences and circulations to build an idea of national art. The Modern Art Week was influenced by the trends of European modernism and had as a proposal to renew the arts from the national perspective. Some of the main representatives and organizers of the event were Mario de Andrade, Oswald de Andrade, Di Cavalcanti. Maybe does this person, so that would be Sueli Campos.
I can refer, I can already start before there is a follow-up, because it makes me think of Sergio Miceli's seminal book on intellectuals in Brazil, who used, he was a Bourdieu student, and he used the concept of field to think about the rise of Brazilian, yes, I understand it's a comment, so of Brazilian nation, how intellectuals contributed to the, and that's true also for European countries in the 19th century. I mean, I can refer to Anne-Marie Thiès' work on the creation of cultural identities, or her recent book on the national writers. It has been a bit marginalized in the history of intellectuals, but it was their first engagement as nationals in the building, in the nation building. And in Brazil, what is very interesting and very different from what happened in Europe is that this national identity in Europe, it was through Romanticism, and in Brazil it is modernism, and modernism was used to this building. So then you can see that modernism is not by definition transnational, or and Romanticism is not essentially national, but it depends how it is, in which context it's brought and how it is used. And I think it's a very interesting comment. Of course, Sergio reflects less on art word in his book. It's more the intellectuals and the writers and the academia, but he's been working also on writers, on artists for the following period. And so I think it's a very interesting comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. Thank you very much for your talk. How would you analyze the interventions of medical doctors and scientists such as Conseil Scientifique in France, but also elsewhere in the world during the COVID pandemic?
Well, thank you so much for this question, and it allows me, I forgot to answer this part of Sebastian's very rich comment before. And of course, it's a crucial question. They intervene as experts, that's very clear. And this expert function has been there, and life scientists have exerted this function for at least 1 century, if not more. But of course, because of the pandemic, they became more visible. There is a very interesting research by Sébastien Lemerle on life scientists as intellectuals. And some of them do exert this function, and it's not new. But of course, all these, the Conseil Scientifique is something built by the state to use their expertise, and you can see always the problem of the relationship between experts, because experts are supposed, this is why I place them on the side of heteronomic, because they have to respond to a demand, and they are not supposed to, they have to make recommendation, but they cannot make any political appreciation, assessment and decision, and this goes to the power. So it's a kind of hierarchical power relation between the political power and the experts, and they frame their intervention is framed by this demand, and they cannot. And you can see that there were tensions when some figure like the head of the Conseil was interviewed a lot in the media, and he was kind of, the government was not very happy that he was saying what he thought publicly, because it might destabilize the kind of policy that the government was trying to conduct, saying they were relying on expert knowledge, which is not always the case, because we can see that in many cases the experts say, no, you should not start a lockdown now, and the politics who want to be re-elected, of course, they say we are doing now the lockdown. So, but I think something is happening, and especially with we'll see. I think it's what for me was more challenged during this period is all the neoliberal predictions and policies. We saw the disaster it produced in hospitals, and I hope it made more people aware, because people care perhaps less of academia, but in hospitals it concerned everybody. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that the government fully revised their neoliberal conceptions, and there has been more money given to hospitals, but not really to go back to the former conception of hospital. But the risk of that is that, I mean, we're facing, now we are not talking anymore about intellectuals, but we are facing a challenge because this disastrous consequences of neoliberalism can and perhaps are bringing about an authoritarian turn rather than a kind of return to a more social rights and the notion of the state that should be there to ensure security and not security. It's not the right word. Not what I meant. I wouldn't mean security on the side of social rights and not security on the side of the more the welfare state, of course.
Another comment. Concerning Sergio Miceli's research on cultural intellectuals and artists in Brazil. He wrote a book focusing specifically on artists and modernism. It is Nacional Estrangeiro, Historia Social y Cultural do Modernismo Artístico en São Paulo, 2003.
Yeah, thank you. This is the book I was referring to, and he also included in this book especially the role of migrants and minorities in the art sphere. But unfortunately, I'm not able to read Portuguese, and it's unfortunately not translated because of the reasons I mentioned before of asymmetry in the circulation of works. But I mean, he presented this work in our seminar because he's also a dear friend, and so I know a little about this work.
Yes, and also Sébastien Lemerle's book you mentioned, so that would be Le singe, le gène et le neurone, is that it?
Exactly.
Okay, let me post the reference here.
Thank you, Sébastien.
I don't know if you want to develop a little further more. I mean, my interest was sort of awakened by your last comments on authoritarian intellectuals who advocate authoritarianism. I don't know if that's a fitting way to end this conversation, but maybe you have some more thoughts on that.
Oh yes, many thoughts, many thoughts, because sometimes you hear that it's a new trend, but I've been working on these authoritarian intellectuals since the 19th century in France. I mean, I've been working on Charles Maurras and all the far right and fascist writers, and I also analyzed the present thinkers in France. I'm not speaking of other regimes, but we have specialists here, for instance, for Turkey, Alihan, and you would be for China. But there have always been, and this is for why I mean, we have the figure of the prophetic intellectuals like Zola or Sartre, who is autonomous. But this is why I did diversify the figures, and I placed the notabilities and also the pamphleteers, because these are more heteronomous intellectuals. Zola, Sartre defend intellectual values. They defend values like truth, justice, based on the specific values of the intellectuals. It's not that I defend all intellectual values. That's not what I mean here to say. But I want to make the argument that the claims for the figure of the intellectual is only one of the different forms and figures of intervention of intellectuals as such. Because we have all these, I call them moralists. So those who, when they are dominant, they happen to talk more like defending morals and the nation. And from the Dreyfus affair, we had the Ligue de la Patrie Française. They were opposing the Dreyfusards. They were the anti-Dreyfusards. This is what Christophe Charles showed, and it was. 2/3 of the Académie Française were on the side of against the Dreyfusards, defending the nation and defending the Vichy regime was partly. I mean, Maurras was Maréchal Pétain's counselor. He had been a pamphleteer opposing all regimes, and suddenly, he hated Germans, and suddenly when France is occupied by the Germans, he had become a notability. He was elected at the Académie Française in 1938, and suddenly he has nothing more to say about foreign policy of France. He says it's a matter of the chef de l'État, of the head of the state, because he recognized him as a real head of the nation, a father, because it's of course family figures, family models, and then he accepts to be just a counselor, while he had been so much criticized, so violently criticized. But many of his ideas were informed the Vichy regime's policy about state anti-Semitism, for instance, and many other things, despite the fact that there was also a more modernistic turn. He was in favor of return to monarchy, and Pétain was a kind of, he was not a king, of course, but he was a kind of authoritarian person that Maurras recognized as the only kind of political figure he would accept.
Thank you.
So we can learn from the past, and also I've been working on these kind of discourses today in France, and they are very much resembling. It's less against Jews and more against Muslims, for instance, but to recognize the same rhetorics, the same arguments, and there is a tradition, and I think this tradition is also transnational. And if you think of Renaud Camus and the Grand Remplacement, I don't know how to translate it, but I know it has a public in the, how do you say?
Replacement, yeah.
Great replacement. He has a community in the United States. His ideas are received. He is not recognized in France as a writer, but he has become a political figure. And we have these kinds of authoritarian figures, even in the Western liberal democracies.
Yeah, well, definitely.
So we have to defend autonomy.
We have a lot more to talk about if we start looking at how the Chinese liberals became fascinated with Donald Trump, or how the pro-regime intellectuals are advocating Carl Schmitt. I think definitely we're going down a path that we maybe already have heard about.
There is a research by David Swartz about the pro-Trump academics, because there are some academics who voted and who defended Trump. So right. David Swartz.
But there's a specific phenomenon of Chinese so-called liberals, but that would probably take us too far today. But yeah, people who are interested in can Google. It's a fascinating phenomenon that almost all of the former, let's say, the leaders of the 1989 democracy movement who were in exile, they have almost all supported Trump and posted about the stolen election, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, lots of food for thought. I think we have to stop here, but I want to thank you once more for this wonderful wide-ranging presentation that took us through a whole universe of both history and various methodological approaches that sort of evolved through your own work. So I'm sure we'll have many more opportunities to discuss these issues, which I'm looking forward to. So thanks again, and thanks to everyone for tuning in tonight. And I do believe that this video will be available eventually on the EHESS website, and there are some other talks coming up in the coming weeks. So thanks again, and have a good evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are.
And thank you so much, Sebastian, for this great discussion and presentation. Thank you.
Bye-bye.